On to Pastor Wiley. He's the pastor here at WPC, Westminster Presbyterian Church. He's written for Modern Reformation, Sacred Architecture, The Imaginative Conservative, Front Porch Republic, Scenes Media, National Review, World Magazine, and is the senior editor for Touchstone Magazine. His short fiction has appeared in the Mythic Circle and elsewhere, and he has published young adult fiction. He has been a commercial real estate investor, a building contractor, and a college professor. He's a member of the Academy of Philosophy and a board member of New St. Andrews College. Would you please welcome Pastor Sierra Wiley?
Thanks, James. It's great to be with you. Thanks for coming out to this event. It's a really encouraging thing to see you all here and to welcome a number of you back. We've had a number of other conferences that a number of you have been a part of, and so we're really glad to have you back. I want to begin with a couple of explanations. One is the name of the talk, Hope in a Scattering Time. I actually stole that, so I got to fess up. There's a book about a guy named Christopher Lasch. It's his biography, and that was the title, Hope in a Scattering Time. So I'll explain what this is intended to imply or is getting at. But I wanted to also note a couple of things that really I want to sort of riff a little bit on Scott's thoughts and comments concerning theology and let you know I agree. But it's a particular way of thinking about theology that's the problem. When we think about, say, covenant theology, what you have is a theological sort of framework that assumes intergenerational family life, right? I mean, what do you have when you don't have families? Can you still have covenant theology? Well, you actually can, but it has to be completely abstracted and turn into a system that you can think about and sort of use to categorize your Christian life and experience. But you don't actually need a family, to have the hermetically sealed mental construct. That's always been a problem in my way of thinking, because I think that you actually do need to have a family and an intergenerational sort of passing on of the faith in order for covenant theology to actually be practiced the way it should be. Let me give you an example of what I'm getting at. So I'm going to talk about Tim Keller briefly. And he wrote a book on marriage. I never read it, so I confess that I'm only working with hearsay here. But I was told that in this book, which I think is like 300, maybe 400 pages in length, something like that, he mentions children how many times do you think? Once. An entire book on marriage written by a Reformed theology icon, a guy that everybody wanted to be like. And, on marriage, I'm not just talking about the Christian life, I'm talking about marriage, and only managed to get to children once. You know why? He was in Manhattan. He was in Manhattan where you don't have kids. You just don't have kids. If you do have kids, you're not there very long. You move out. I know Manhattan. I've been there dozens of times. I was at Keller's church half a dozen times. You know how many kids I counted at Keller's church? 0. Now, they were a church that didn't encourage you to have your kids with you in church. So that's part of the story. But the other thing is essentially it was a youth group for people in their 30s. Single people in their 30s loved Keller's church. And it was like Friends. It was like take the show Friends and then give them a church. And that's what you have there. And I will stand up and defend those statements, no problem with anybody. I was there. I've seen it. I know what Manhattan's like. I've lived in the city. I was involved in urban ministry for a decade. I know what that scene is like. So anyway, until we make a connection to family life with our covenant theology, what Scott said is absolutely right. Having the right theology, conceptually, abstractly, is not going to help. It's got to connect. It's got to connect to life. It's got to connect to family life. Now, another thing, just to kind of give you a little bit of background on, I don't come from a Christian family. I was actually baptized Episcopalian, which just is the same thing, not coming from a Christian. I'm just, but anyway, so my father was an academic, so I grew up around college campuses when I was small. And I actually was baptized Episcopalian, and the old joke, whether high or low, the status is always quo. It's true. So in that environment, my mother, if my mother were alive today, she'd be definitely a Kamala supporter. No doubt in my mind. What's that?
She's still
But my father, he was a seeker, and in those days, seekers could be described as, ABC, anything but Christianity. And he got into all kinds of stuff, got into the Baha'is, eventually ended up in Scientology. So by the time I was about 6 or 7 years old, my family were Scientologists. My father's a Scientologist to this day. They have a Benedict option community in Florida called Clearwater, and they just kind of live there. They've just kind of colonized the place. So that's like Scientology heaven down there. It's actually hell, but that's what they think of it as kind of a heavenly place to live. But anyway, so that kind of is, sort of the background that informs a lot of my thinking. At a very visceral level, I despise the left. So it's not even like something I'm willing to entertain. And the reason is family background. But you get where I'm going with this. Family makes a difference in lots of ways. Bad experiences can lead to kind of opening you up to new things. Good experiences can set you on a particular path and get you thinking in a certain way that you want to perpetuate. Covenant theology ties into that perfectly. And one of the things that drew me to covenant theology was that there is a connection between what we're talking about and how we live. Crazy idea, isn't it? What you talk about, what you live. So let me get into my talk. Begin with 3 scriptures. First is, hope deferred makes the heart sick. Hope deferred makes the heart sick. Proverbs 13:12. For everything there is a season, a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together. Ecclesiastes 3. Thus says the Lord, stand by the roads and look and ask for the ancient paths where the good way is and walk in it and find rest for your souls. Jeremiah 6:16. We live in a scattering time. The acids of the modern world break the bonds that hold us together. Zygmunt Bauman published a book a few years ago entitled Liquid Modernity. The title was a riff on something Marx said about the modern world, pardon me, in the Communist Manifesto. All that's solid melts into air. All that is holy is profaned. Nothing is stable. Stable points of reference have been lost, or at least are considered oppressive or impediments to progress. I recall years ago when I lived in Cambridge in the 1990s, that's another thing I'll make it conservative. You need to live in a place like Cambridge for an extended period of time, and you either become totally nuts or you're cured. I came to see that even heretofore common sense home truths such as men can't have babies were considered blasphemous by cultured elites. When I warned people in the hinterlands of evangelicalism about what was coming, they thought I was an alarmist. And no one took me seriously. But I was right and they were wrong. But I wish that wasn't the case, really. And we can all see that I was right now. And when it comes to progress, now even the human mind must give way to technology because we're too slow, error-prone, and inefficient. The machines will do thinking for us from now on. And even if you have reservations about that development, as I do, you will need to adapt or go out of business, seeing as human beings are no longer sacrosanct images of God, but merely human resources to be replaced with mechanical ones. Even so, with these developments, there are reasons for hope, because there always are. Where there's life, there's hope. And hope is necessary if you're going to have kids in a scattering time. Whether it goes by the name of progress or something else, sterility is death. I remember back in the 90s, silence is death. You remember that little slogan that the LGBTQ, the gays, came up with? You'd see it, they would put their stickers everywhere and no one would ever arrest them. But you'd find them all over the place. And that was one of their favorite sayings, silence is death. Silence is death. Actually, sterility is death. It should be evident that there's something paradoxical about the situation we find ourselves in, because in order to restore hope, we will have to kill some of the modern world's sacred cows. And one of them is that we should live in a world without limits. Now, allow me to explain what I mean. There are at least 3 limits that we must accept if we're going to fill the world of tomorrow with little versions of ourselves. Not only that, they're also necessary to accept if we're going to have a future that's worth living in at all. The first limit is commitment. This is what necessarily follows from commitment. In other words, a limit. So, when it comes to children, at least healthy ones, the first commitment you'll have to make is to a particular woman. Naturally, we all long for companionship, among other things, but we also fear betrayal. And I actually think this is a major problem right now. A lot of guys are really very cynical about women because they are afraid that they're going to be betrayed. Yet we know intuitively that we can't have the first, which is companionship, unless we are willing to risk experiencing the second, which is betrayal. But there's something else that we fear. We fear missing out. We like to keep our options open because making a commitment means you're no longer free to make another choice. We prefer choices to choosing, and so we don't choose. We see this at work when it's come to the dating scene. The internet is now the place people go for love because the internet seems to maximize choice, among other reasons, but that's one of them. And this leads to swiping left. I don't know if you've heard that term, because people are afraid of missing out on something better. But are people happier when their choices become seemingly limitless? I can never find anything to watch on television, and I've got 5 million options. Partly, I cannot kind of reconcile myself to having to make a choice and settle for one show over another, because I'm afraid I will what? Miss out. So we should be happier than ever as the choices have increased, but we're actually not. We're not as happy as we used to be. There actually have been studies to demonstrate that that's the case. Even subjective, something as subjective as perceived happiness can in some sense be measured. Now here are some statistics to consider. I came across this the other day. It's fascinating. This is from a Stanford University study on how couples met. How couples met. So in 1936, 22% roughly of the couples that met and married and so forth consisted of 22% of the married population. School made up another 21%, friends 20%, and church a little over 9%. So all of those unions in 1936 kind of broke down. There are other categories, of course, but I just limited myself to those top 4. 1962, which is the year I was born. In 1962, friends replaced family as the -- way that people got to know each other, came together. And that was nearly 25%. Nearly 25% of the people who got married in 1962 met each other through friends, friendship connections. Family was still in a respectable spot. Almost 19% came to know each other through family connections. School enters the scene at this point. Just a little over 15% of the people who got married in 1962 met each other through school. Church still made a showing, almost 6%. Almost 6% of the people who got married in 1962 met at church. 1985. Why did I pick that year? Well, that's the year that my wife and I got married. So, 1985. So, in 1985, friends, the connection was made through friends for almost 27% of the couples who got married. Now, we have another category that has kind of emerged, and this reflects sort of the fact that there are more and more women in the workforce, even in 1985. Coworkers. Coworkers were the means by which 15% of the people who got married came to know each other. Now, here's an interesting one. In 1985, and this reflects the scene in those days, and I remember those days real well, 15% came to know each other through the bar scene. So that wasn't even on the list, back in 1962 or 1936, but now it's pretty significant. But the church is still there, about 5.5%. About 5.5% of people met through church. 2024, internet. 61%. Just amazing to see what's happened. Friends, a distant second at just a little under 14%. Co-workers still make a showing at 8.5%, and the church is down to just a little over 2% today. Now, I posted this online, and people responded with a range of responses, but some of the younger folks were like, what's the problem? Literally. They say, hey, I don't see what the problem is. Well, I tell you what the problem is. It means that human connections are atrophying, and those human connections are being replaced with the internet, right? That's the means by which people are connecting, primarily is through the internet. Now, it doesn't always work out badly, but sometimes it does. And the old way it worked out badly sometimes too. But what I'm getting at is that our communities are kind of melting away and being replaced by a virtual community. Now, here's a paradox. The best and freest lives are often lived in constrained circumstances. I don't know if you've noticed this, but it's a reality. Perhaps you have grandparents who met in high school, got married, and then lived happily ever after. I've known a number of people like that. I think they're rarer than ever, but how do we explain it when they had almost like no choices? Like, Grandpa said, I always knew her, I met her in kindergarten. Fell in love with her even then, and I knew she was going to be my wife, and then next thing you know, they get married and they're happy. How do we explain it? I think in part it has something to do with limits. The limits have a way of channeling our energies, our creative energies. Now, I'm an artist and a writer, and the most intimidating thing that I face, you could even call it oppressive, is a blank page. You sit there and there's the page, nothing on it. I feel oppressed. It's the first sentence that you write, or the first line that you draw, that does two things. First, it closes off most possibilities. When the first sentence is written, you can't just have a story be about anything anymore. You got to work with that. Same thing with the first line. Then one sentence builds on the one that came before, and the next line connects to the one already drawn. And as the process goes on, the possibilities get fewer and fewer, but something new comes into existence. But without making a commitment, writing a particular sentence or drawing a particular line, nothing new forms. Instead, all you have is unrealized potential. Unrealized potential is nothing. Choices without choosing is sterile. You've got nothing to show for it. Let me finish with two examples for how this works before moving on. Great works of architecture begin with a natural environment. So I've written for Sacred Architecture. I'm not an architect, but I have friends. And they tell me that this is true. So great works of architecture begin with a natural environment or a built one that limit what you can do. For instance, Frank Lloyd Wright's Falling Water in Mill Run, Pennsylvania, which is considered kind of an masterpiece of residential architecture, is a home built over a waterfall. The waterfall provided enormous challenges to overcome that you simply don't face with your typical flat, square, Midwestern building lot. You know, when you get onto a flat, square, Midwestern building lot, you can say, this is like the dullest building lot in the world, and we could put anything here. And what do you end up putting up? Exactly the same thing you put on the last slide. And then so on it goes. But anyway, or take Fenway Park in Boston. Famous for the Green Monster. That crazy tall wall in left field. I think it's like 38 feet high. The reason is Lansdowne Street, which simply could not be moved and made left field too short for a major league ballpark. So the solution was that 38-foot tall wall, the Green Monster. Another interesting example of creativity and constraints is beer commercials. In the United States, it is illegal to show someone drinking beer in a beer commercial. I don't know if you realize that, but think about that constraint. Okay, we're going to sell beer, but no one can like drink the beer and say, man, that was good. You know, you just sit there, you should have this beer. You can't do that. It's not allowed. So what do? Well, your creative energies are channeled in such a way as you end up with, what's up? Stuff like that. You know, in other words, you have to get really creative and kind of fun to sell the beer, because you just can't have a guy sit down and have, here's a Pabst Blue Ribbon and here's a Miller Lite, and they drink them both and say, I like this one better. You're just not allowed to do that. You have to get really creative. So constraints, limits, are actually conducive to creativity. That's where creativity blossoms, is with limits and commitments. It's not in spite of those things, but because of them that we end up with really remarkable stuff and interesting things. And when it comes to a wife, the covenant you made with that particular woman, with all of her strengths and weaknesses, help to direct your creative juices down a particular channel that leads to fruitfulness and to a life that you lead together. So that's the first limit. You need to make a commitment. In other words, there's a commitment and then you're limited. There are certain things that are no longer open to you. You've made a choice. You don't just simply want choices, right? In other words, you're constraining your freedom in order to be free to do something worthwhile. So the next limit is a big story. Another fundamental conviction of modern people is that we live in a meaningless universe. It's nothing more than a vast and purposeless machine, and it is believed that if you suggest otherwise, you're either benighted, or worse, you might literally be Hitler. Every so-called meta-narrative, have you come across this term, meta-narrative? I'm glad that you guys haven't come across that. That's an indication that you've not been, in an English department in the last 30 years in the academy. But meta-narrative is a big story. It's a big story. The Bible is a big story. It tells us not just about particular people, but it tells us about everything, creation itself, right? It's a big story. But every so-called meta-narrative with our cultured elites is nothing but a big lie that powerful people use to take advantage of and control other people with. That's the kind of the baseline conviction of people in the academy today. I'm talking about the vast majority of them, not just a small group. But in fact, if you find, we have a couple of unique fossils here that we have from an earlier time where they don't believe that. But I think that they would agree that that's what most of their colleagues in those schools that they've been a part of do believe, except for you, Allan, because you're at Hillsdale, so that's kind of like a Jurassic Park collection of, old dinosaurs that would be extinct in any other environment. But anyway, I love Hillsdale, by the way. I'm having fun with it. I've got friends in the faculty. But anyway, now, two favorite classes of people to accuse of this meta-narrative oppression are, guess what? White men, naturally, and religious leaders. Since I'm both, I'm literally Hitler in the minds of many people. Now, puzzlingly, few people notice that this, in other words, the story that everything is a meta-narrative, is also a meta-narrative. And if they're correct, then the people who tell that story are also up to no good. They're just out for their own purposes, or they're serving their own agenda, right? Now, if that's true, then we shouldn't trust any story except the one that we make up for ourselves, and that is the regime that we live in right now. Everybody has their own story. We're all supposed to affirm each other's stories, no matter how crazy they become, and to do otherwise would be bad, right? Now, the question I think that follows quite naturally is, why should the story that I tell myself be any better? We might discover, or I might discover, that one part of myself is oppressing another part of myself. That, by the way, is exactly what, people like Foucault and other French post-modernist literary types believe. So, in other words, if your faculty, your power to reason, in other words, directs sort of your sexual conduct in a way that denies what you want to do, in other words, your sexual urges, then, you're logocentric, and that part of you is oppressing another part of you, and you should let that be liberated. Foucault was a self-destructive homosexual, and he died young. Anyway, he's not even with us anymore because he decided to go with it. Oh, we'll let you fill us in on that during the question and answer time. Anyway, so now all of this suspicion naturally leads to people feeling isolated, lonely, miserable, and even mentally ill. And mental illness, this is something that is like a growing problem. I don't know if you've seen some of the statistics on young women, particularly who spend a lot of time on social media. Their mental health is just the pits. They're not doing well at all. Maybe that contributes to this sense of I'm impressed, more impressed than I've ever been, kind of stuff, craziness. So let's remember something that should be self-evident. In order to live and work together, we need to share a meaningful story. We need to share a story. We need to share a story. So where should we look for it, and what should characterize that story? In the Bible, Jeremiah tells us to look backward to the ancient paths, because he found himself, as we find ourselves, in a world that is coming to an end. Things are falling apart. Now, I'm not a doomer. I'm actually very upbeat. I'm optimistic. I'm forward-looking. I think the future can be great. And I'm helping, as best I can to kind of bring that about. But at the same time, we're told in Scripture that the things that could be shaken are being shaken. In Hebrews, I don't know if you recall that, so that the things that can't be shaken remain. We're in one of those shaking moments. Now, just because we need a big story in order to live and work together doesn't mean that every story is created equal. Stories like Marxism, for example, and even more recently transhumanism, are bad stories. They're just bad stories because they're modern ones, based on the conviction that the world is a meaningless place, and if there's any reason to live, we'll have to invent it. But that just leaves us suspicious and lonely because we're always thinking, who's taking advantage of me, right? But the world is suffused with meaning, and any story we tell ourselves must begin with the story that we find ourselves in already. We're not brooding over a formless void like the Spirit of the Lord at the opening of Genesis. We find ourselves in a world filled with things that we didn't make and we shouldn't take for granted. This limits us in important ways, but it also means that we can be genuinely creative, and that's not a contradiction. If you go back to my earlier point, hopefully you'll see that. So we begin with the world that God has made. God has made the world. Now, we might use the term natural law to understand how we have been made and how we are both limited but also have creative potential. For example, male and female, he made them. It's just simply a fact that this is so. Male and female, he made them. And then we can move on to his commands, which might be referred to as positive law. Be fruitful and multiply. So this is the indicative, the imperative. The indicative, male and female, he made them. The imperative is be fruitful and multiply. Okay? Natural law, positive law. And because both laws have their origin in God, they're divine law. And consequently, the channel he's given us to tell our stories that are in keeping with the story that he's telling. So we do have some creative capacity. We've got a range of things that we can do. Tolkien, in his writing, or in his way of thinking about his own writing, would call this subcreation. There is a created order that we find ourselves in, but then derivatively, we work with that created order to tell our own stories and create new things. Now, there's another limit. This is the third limit I want to talk about, and that's God's judgments. And this is the ultimate limit. His judgments put an end to things, put an end to debate, sometimes put an end to civilization, and sometimes the judgment is occasioned by a direct and unambiguous action, like in Eden or with Cain or the flood or Babel. One of the things you see, particularly in Genesis, is that when the Lord comes down to check out what people are up to, it's generally a sign that judgment's about to follow. It's kind of like when a father's at the top of the basement steps and he hears his kids in the basement messing with stuff, or maybe there's an older brother that's tormenting his siblings, torturing them, and he says from the doorway, "Don't make me come down there." That's intended to be kind of like the early warning, because if this keeps up, I will come down there and put an end to it. And that's what you have often in Genesis. What are they up to down there? I'm going to check it out. So now in that case, God's providence in those events are like a positive law, direct actions that supersede the order of things. So there's a natural order, but every once in a while, in God's providence, he acts in such a way that's historical in character, and he puts an end to things. But most of the time, we simply reap what we've sown in the order of things. There are just consequences. Consequences for living a certain way, behaving a certain way. And our actions can lead to consequences that are finally felt. That's kind of a natural process, like a natural law almost. So like, for example, if you jump off a skyscraper, it might take some time to hit the bottom, but eventually you will. It's nothing personal, you just should have known better. And that's kind of what we see, all around us right now. There's a lot of stupidity, but we live in a world where there's just a lot of margin for error. And so because we have such a tremendously large margin for error, the stupidity can go on for a really long time. I remember years ago, I made an observation between down and outers and up and outers. So I've had the privilege and opportunity to minister to both. Now, most folks understand what a down and outer is. This is a person that maybe is on the street, addicted to drugs, can't keep a job, just miserable, sleeping in their own urine, that kind of stuff. That's a down and outer. What's an up and outer? An up and outer is suffering from all the same problems, broken home, drug addiction, but they got a lot of money, a lot of connections, and a lot of education, and it can go on for a long, long time. And I've known folks like that. They're just as, I remember I had a friend, his name was Roger Dewey. He was working in the inner city for years in Boston, and then he just disappeared. He had an organization called Christians for Urban Justice, so he's kind of left-wing Ron Sider type. Anyway, he was doing that for a long time and then just disappeared and then reappeared, and he was a chaplain at an exclusive boarding school in New England. I was like, Roger, how did you go from that to that? He said, there's not a whole lot of difference. Dads are all sleeping around, never home. Everybody's addicted to drugs. It's just nuts. He said the difference is money and education and connections. That's the difference. So don't necessarily envy those folks you see on Instagram with the fancy lives. They can be just as miserable as anybody you meet on the street, and often are. Now, there's a big difference between the laws of nature, of course, and natural law. But defying either has consequences. And today we're beginning to see and feel the consequences of being a law unto ourselves. Progressives are the embodiment of irony when it comes to reproduction. Claiming to be humanists, they've stopped making humans. I don't know if you noticed this. They even think humans are really bad to have, and humans shouldn't have any more humans. That's kind of the heart of humanism today. Fertility inevitably drops as you move left politically. Just look at the reason why so many young women, speaking to this problem of, infertility or women who are not interested in having children, the women who do have children generally see the world the same way that their husbands do and vote the same way their husbands do. But women who are childless, generally speaking, vote left. Had an interesting experience. It was kind of creepy here the other day. So we had a canvasser for the Democratic Party come to my house. So everybody in our neighborhood knows a Republican because we have this big Joe Kent sign right on the front lawn. And this guy was canvassing for his opponent, Marie Perez. And he comes to the door and he doesn't just say hello, he asks for my wife by name. I'm like, how did you know her name? Well, I don't know how he knew her name, but I did a little checking, and it turns out that it just may very well be the case that within sort of Democratic circles, the goal is to actually split the vote in households between husbands and wives that are registered Republican, because my wife is registered Republican, I am, and they're kind of using some leverage to do that, and are actually willing to go to your front door and confront your wife. Kind of weird stuff, but it kind of reflects what I'm getting at. My wife is very solid Republican. You don't need to worry about her. Anyway, in fact, she shooed him away. She said, "No, go away." That's actually she said. Now, freedom for these people means maximizing freedom in the moment. And this is one of the weird things about progressivism. Progressivism is not about the future. It's about the present. They're all about maximizing freedom of choice in the present. That means, obviously contraception and abortion, and we've heard this ad nauseum that choice is the thing that they want to preserve. They don't want you to make a choice. They want you to have a set of choices. And it also means freedom from math. In this case, math shows you that you can't pay for social services you depend on in lieu of children when you've not had enough children to pay for them. That's what we're experiencing in our society. If you're wondering, why should we even be worried about this? We really do depend on our kids. The whole Social Security system is just basically the government becoming the fiduciary between the generations. There's not like this big lockbox that Al Gore was talking about, where all of our money just goes and just waits for us to get old enough to withdraw it. The money that goes in goes out right now. And we kind of know when the system's going to go bust. The trends continue. It'll be in the early 2030s. It'll just simply not be solvent. So, a lot of folks who, and it's not just that. I mean, the whole market economy is going to be affected. That's something else to think about. What supports prices? Demand. When you have less demand, what happens? Well, they learned in Detroit. Everything collapses. Prices collapse. Neighborhoods collapse. So there are some people out there who say, oh, great, deflation. Well, yeah, I mean, I think deflation can be good in the short term. But in the long term, prices keep going down, like with no end in sight. What do you call that? You call that depression. Right? That's what may be in store for us, maybe. Now, of course, math is racist, particularly when it tells you something as illiberal as this. And I really do think that a lot of folks are banking on the technological solution to give us a world of limitless abundance where no one needs to work anymore. I've actually read stuff by those people, and some people are banking on that. Other people are banking on immigration. But what do you do if the United States becomes a banana republic? There's no reason to move. Hey, I live in a banana republic. Why move to that other one? So again, there's a kind of begging the question phenomenon that we're dealing with here. I know there's an assumption that's been made that we'll always have people who want to be here. That's not necessarily the case. And then there's the fact that Mexico now has a lower birth rate than we do. Did you know that? And that goes for most of the world except sub-Saharan Africa and some parts of Southeast Asia. Now, it seems as though we're living in sort of an environment with kind of the feeling of impending doom. And we don't like talking about it in polite circles, but doesn't even that kind of also affect this downward pull on fertility, this sense, and this is what Scott was getting at when you just kind of like are old and kind of decrepit and as a civilization and you don't have any hope. Well, not necessarily. The God who is judging the world for its sins, and I do believe that's what's going on, is the God who said, be fruitful and multiply. Eric Kaufman, that's a name that maybe rings a bell for some guys, wrote an unpopular book, or published an unpopular book about a decade ago or so, and it was entitled, Shall the Religious Inherit the Earth? In which he simply pointed to the math. And he said, if this keeps up, yes. If this keeps up, yes, we will inherit the earth. There are promises throughout Scripture in which we're told that the wicked are storing up their wealth for us. Keep at it. Go for it, baby. Make some big money and have no kids. We'll just kind of like move in someday. Good stuff. Now, this hits at the secret for having hope in this scattering time. We don't have hope because we can gin it up out of thin air. We have hope because God gives us reasons for hope. He's promised us victory. He's promised us the wealth of our enemies. When was the last time you heard a preacher address that? And if we believe it, we'll keep his commandments. And when we have kids, we're banking on God. When we have kids, we're banking on God. Keep that in mind. And we also have a very direct and personal reason for hope, because they live because he lives. And where there's life, there's hope. Thank you.